Henry Thompson's trembling hands held onto his worn-out wallet as he approached the bustling counter of the popular Bristol Café. The morning crowd buzzed with energy. Business professionals in crisp suits, students clutching textbooks, and baristas shouting out drink orders over the clatter of ceramic mugs. Henry took a deep breath, his voice wavering as he addressed the young cashier. "Just a plain ham sandwich, please," he managed to say, hoping to be quick and not in anyone's way. The cashier, a boy not older than 20, shot Henry a condescending look, his eyes flicking down to the frayed edges of Henry's old jacket and scuffed shoes. A smirk twisted the corner of his mouth. "You sure you can afford that, old man?" he asked, his voice loud enough for nearby customers to hear. Laughter erupted from a couple of teenage girls sitting close to the counter, and Henry's face flushed with embarrassment. Henry fumbled with his wallet, his fingers unsteady as he counted out a few coins. The sound of mocking chuckles echoed around him, and he felt the weight of countless eyes on his back, judging and pitying him in equal measure. He tried to hold back the feeling of shame that threatened to break through his stoic exterior. His life had once been full of honor and purpose, but now, in this cafe, he was just an old man trying to buy a sandwich. Nearby, Charlotte Blake observed the entire interaction, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. Her sharp eyes, framed by designer glasses, narrowed as she watched the scene unfold. Charlotte was used to the polished world of high-stakes real estate and luxurious charity events, but this felt different. Uncomfortable, personal. Something in the way Henry shrank under the weight of humiliation struck a nerve. But she stayed seated, her curiosity piqued. There was something about this old man that she couldn't quite put her finger on. She noticed the deep lines etched on his face, lines that spoke of hardship and stories untold. Her gaze drifted down to his left forearm, and that's when she saw it, a faded, almost unrecognizable tattoo. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. It was a symbol she had seen once before a long time ago, in one of her late grandfather's war memorabilia boxes. Henry managed to scrape together enough coins for the sandwich, but the sting of humiliation lingered. He shuffled away from the counter, gripping his modest purchase like a lifeline. As he passed Charlotte, he didn't notice her watching him, her curiosity now replaced by an urgent sense of recognition. Henry settled at a small, unremarkable table in the corner of the cafe, away from the chatter and the indifference that filled the room. He took a shaky breath, unwrapping his sandwich with an air of quiet dignity. But the echoes of laughter still stung his ears. His pride had taken hits before, countless ones, but they never seemed to hurt less with time. He bit into the bread, dry and plain, and willed himself to forget the feeling of eyes burning holes into his back. Charlotte Blake continued to watch, her mind racing. The faded tattoo she had noticed on Henry's forearm wasn't just any random symbol. It was a unit insignia from the Second World War, one that she knew all too well from stories passed down through her family. Her grandfather, a man she deeply admired, had often spoken of the soldiers who had risked their lives for freedom, and this emblem had been featured in more than one tale of heroism. Charlotte set her coffee down, her usually calm demeanor unraveling slightly. Was this old man one of those heroes her grandfather had once praised so highly? Her initial discomfort now turned into a compulsion to act, to find out more about this stranger. She couldn't ignore the pull of recognition or the sense that there was something significant unfolding right before her eyes. She stood up, her designer heels clicking against the tiled floor as she made her way over to Henry's table. He didn't look up, still focused on his sandwich, but Charlotte noticed how his hands shook ever so slightly as he ate. She cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me," she began, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone used to getting attention. Henry flinched, startled, and looked up to see a well-dressed woman standing before him. Her presence was a stark contrast to his faded attire and weathered features. His eyes, pale with age, studied her face for a moment, trying to gauge her intentions. Was she here to mock him as well? To pile on another layer of embarrassment? He braced himself. "I couldn't help but notice," Charlotte continued, gesturing delicately toward his forearm. "That tattoo, it's from the war, isn't it?" Henry's gaze followed her finger, landing on the inked emblem that had long since lost its vibrancy. Memories flooded his mind, but he didn't respond right away. He had learned to keep his past tucked away, to avoid the questions that often led to uncomfortable conversations. But there was something about Charlotte's voice, something almost reverent, that made him pause. "Yes," he finally replied, his voice low and measured. "It's from my unit in the war." He didn't offer more, but his eyes told a different story, one filled with the weight of experiences that words could never fully capture. Charlotte's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't just a random moment of curiosity. It felt like fate, like a piece of history suddenly made real before her eyes. Her mind buzzed with questions, but she forced herself to slow down. The last thing she wanted was to overwhelm him. Instead, she chose her next words carefully, hoping to bridge the chasm between them. "Would you mind telling me more about it?" she asked softly. Henry looked at her, surprised, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly seen. Henry's eyes narrowed, studying Charlotte for a moment. People rarely asked about his past, and when they did, it was often out of shallow curiosity or pity. But this woman, standing before him in her tailored clothes and polished demeanor, seemed genuinely interested. There was something in her expression, a mixture of respect and urgency, that made him reconsider his usual reluctance to share. He set his sandwich down, wiped his hands on a napkin, and took a slow, deliberate breath. "The war," he started, his voice rough but steady, "was a lifetime ago. Yet, some things never really leave you." He glanced down at his tattoo, the ink that had once symbolized youthful pride, now a reminder of burdens carried through decades. "I was part of a division sent to liberate occupied territories in Europe. We were young, brave, and foolish enough to think we could change the world." Charlotte pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, her movements uncharacteristically tentative. She didn't interrupt, didn't try to fill the space with her own thoughts. Instead, she listened, a skill honed over years of high-stakes meetings, but now employed for something far more meaningful. Henry's gaze grew distant as memories surfaced. "There was one village," he continued, "nestled in the hills of France. We arrived just in time, pushing back the enemy forces. I remember the people there, how they wept and clung to us as if we were their saviors. It was the first time I felt like we were doing something truly good, something that mattered." Charlotte's heart clenched. She could almost hear her late grandfather's voice, recounting the tales of that very village and the brave souls who had saved it. Her grandfather had always spoken with a sense of awe, as if those soldiers were legends rather than ordinary men. And here one of them sat before her, real and human, with worn hands and a voice filled with echoes of the past. Henry's eyes clouded over, the weight of grief pressing down on his chest. "But war doesn't let you play the hero without a cost," he said, his voice cracking. "I lost friends there, good men who never made it home. We fought so others could live, but the price," he trailed off, shaking his head. The silence between them felt heavy, yet Charlotte couldn't bring herself to break it. Finally, she leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "My grandfather," she began, her hands clasped together as if to steady herself, "grew up in that village. He used to tell me about the soldiers who saved them, who brought hope when everything seemed lost. He never forgot, you know. He spoke of your bravery until his dying day." Henry looked up, and for the first time, tears shimmered in his pale eyes. It had been years since he had felt that his sacrifices meant anything to anyone. To hear that his actions had rippled across time, touching lives he never knew, was a comfort he hadn't expected. "Your grandfather," he murmured, a faint smile breaking through his sorrow, "must have been a good man." Charlotte nodded, her own eyes misty. "He was," she said, "and so are you." The noise of the cafe seemed to fade into the background as an unspoken understanding formed between them, a bridge built from shared history and the silent acknowledgement of pain and gratitude. Henry leaned back in his chair, his body sagging under the weight of memories. The moment of connection he had just experienced with Charlotte felt almost surreal. For so many years, he had carried the past alone, quietly, without expecting anyone to understand or care. Yet here she was, a stranger whose eyes told him She felt every word he said. He rubbed his hands together, trying to summon warmth into his old, aching joints. "You know," he said, his voice low and contemplative, "people think war is all about battles and victories. But the hardest part is what comes after, when the guns have stopped and you're left with the silence. You come home, but nothing feels like home anymore. You try to move on, but the ghosts, they stay with you." Charlotte's throat tightened. She had never thought much about the quiet aftermath of war, the emptiness that must have followed. Her life was filled with deadlines, deals, and endless noise. But in this moment, she felt humbled by the realization of how small her own struggles seemed compared to the battles Henry fought every day, long after the war had ended. Henry's gaze drifted to the window, where the world carried on, oblivious to the history in the room. "I had a wife once," he continued, his voice taking on a wistful tone. "Mary. We got married just before I was deployed. She was my light, the one thing that kept me holding on." He paused, and a tear slipped down his lined cheek. "But when I came back, I wasn't the same man she married. The war had taken pieces of me I could never get back. We tried to make it work, but she deserved more than half a husband." Charlotte reached out instinctively, her hand resting lightly on the table between them. She didn't know what to say, but her silence was filled with understanding. The pain of a broken life, of sacrifices made and love lost, felt almost tangible in the space between them. Henry wiped his tear away, embarrassed by the show of emotion. "She found happiness later," he added, his voice thick. "Remarried, had children. I was glad for her, but it left me with this feeling, like I was a ghost wandering through a life that no longer fit me." Charlotte's heart ached for him. Here was a man who had given everything, yet received so little in return. It wasn't fair, but life rarely was. And as she sat there, absorbing the depth of his loss, she knew she couldn't just walk away from this encounter. Something had to change. She cleared her throat, trying to gather her thoughts. "Henry," she said gently, "you shouldn't have to carry this alone. People need to hear your story, to remember what you and your brothers in arms did. It matters." Her voice wavered with conviction, and Henry looked at her, surprised. "Do you really think it matters anymore?" he asked, his voice filled with equal parts hope and doubt. Charlotte's eyes met his, steady and sincere. "Yes," she said firmly, "it matters, and I want to help make sure it does." For a moment, neither of them spoke, but the weight of that promise hung in the air, a seed of something new and hopeful, ready to take root. Henry sat still, absorbing Charlotte's words. The idea that his story might still hold significance in a world that had long since moved on felt foreign, almost absurd. Yet the way she looked at him, with unwavering sincerity, made him wonder if perhaps there was truth in what she said. His hands, now steadier, rested on the table as he considered the young woman before him. "You know," he murmured, a trace of disbelief in his voice, "I've spent so long thinking the world had forgotten." Charlotte leaned forward, her eyes bright with an urgency that surprised even her. "Some of us haven't," she insisted, "and more people need to know. If they did, maybe we'd understand the cost of the lives we have now. The freedom, the peace. You gave us that, Henry. You and the men who stood beside you." Henry was silent for a long moment. The memories of those men, his brothers in arms, flickered across his mind. Young, strong, full of dreams. Men who had joked in the barracks, made plans for futures that never came. Men who had fallen, their voices forever silenced. The grief was always there, a part of him, but so was the pride of having known them. "I'm not sure where to begin," he finally said, his voice cracking. "How do you tell the world about boys who never got to grow old? About moments so heavy they steal your breath, even decades later?" His eyes met Charlotte's, and she saw a vulnerability there that broke her heart. For a man who had faced death, this, bearing his soul, seemed like the hardest battle of all. Charlotte considered his question, choosing her words carefully. "We start where it hurts the most," she said softly. "The stories that haunt you, the memories that keep you awake at night. People need to feel it to understand that freedom isn't free. Maybe if they hear it from someone like you, they'll never forget." Henry swallowed, his throat tight with emotion. Her words stirred something deep within him, a mix of fear and a faint flicker of hope. Sharing his past would mean reliving it, facing the ghosts that had kept him company for so long. But if it meant giving voice to the fallen, if it meant honoring their sacrifice, maybe it was a burden worth carrying one last time. "All right," he whispered, almost to himself. "All right. If it means they'll be remembered, I'll try." His agreement felt monumental, like a door creaking open after being locked for years. Charlotte's expression softened with relief, and she smiled, a warm, genuine smile that seemed to light up the room. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. "You won't regret this, Henry. I promise." He nodded, the weight of his decision settling over him. But this time it felt different, less isolating, as if, in sharing his story, he might find some measure of peace. For now, though, he allowed himself a small, hopeful smile. Perhaps the world hadn't forgotten after all. The hum of the cafe carried on, oblivious to the gravity of the conversation happening in the far corner. Henry's tentative smile faded as he noticed a few glances cast in his direction. The barista who had humiliated him earlier leaned against the counter, whispering something to a coworker, both of them chuckling softly. The sense of unease crept back into Henry's chest, a familiar weight that threatened to overshadow the moment of hope he had just shared with Charlotte. Charlotte noticed, too, the subtle ridicule, the casual disregard for a man who had lived more life and carried more stories than most could imagine. Her jaw tightened. She had spent years commanding boardrooms and navigating high-stakes negotiations. She wasn't used to standing by when something felt so fundamentally wrong. A spark of anger flared in her, and she knew she couldn't let this go unchallenged. She pushed her chair back, the scrape of metal against the floor drawing attention. Henry's eyes widened as she stood up, but she offered him a reassuring look before making her way to the front of the cafe. The baristas fell silent as she approached, her presence commanding attention despite her petite frame. Charlotte crossed her arms, her voice clear and unyielding. "Excuse me," she said, her tone cool and authoritative, "but I couldn't help noticing the way you treated that man." She gestured back toward Henry, who sat frozen, unsure of whether to intervene or stay put. "Do you have any idea who he is? What he's done for this country?" The young cashier's smirk faltered, replaced by a look of discomfort. "Look, lady, we treat everyone the same here," he stammered. "It's not like we meant any harm." Charlotte's eyes narrowed. "Treating everyone the same doesn't mean treating people with disrespect," she retorted. "That man you just humiliated risked his life in a war, so you could have the freedom to work in this cafe. He's a hero, whether you care to acknowledge it or not." A hush fell over the surrounding tables. Some customers exchanged glances, realizing for the first time the significance of the man sitting quietly in the corner. Henry's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but there was also a flicker of something else, a small sense of validation he hadn't felt in years. The manager, a middle-aged woman with weary eyes, stepped forward. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice wary but polite. Charlotte took a breath, reining in her frustration. "The problem," she said evenly, "is that we've forgotten how to honor the people who built the world we take for granted. A simple act of kindness and respect is the least we can offer." The manager's expression softened as she glanced toward Henry. Guilt and realization crossed her features, and she nodded. "You're right," she admitted. "I'll speak to the staff." Her eyes found Henry's, and she gave him a small, apologetic smile. "Sir, I'm sorry for any disrespect you experienced here today." Henry nodded slowly, the apology sinking in. It didn't erase the years of feeling invisible, but it mattered. He met Charlotte's eyes, a silent exchange of gratitude passing between them. She had stood up for him, for his story, and in that moment he felt less like a ghost and more like a man who still had a place in the world. Charlotte returned to her seat, her anger giving way to a sense of calm. Henry looked at her, the hint of a smile returning. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice a mix of admiration and disbelief. She tilted her head, a playful glint in her eyes. "Maybe not," she replied, "but I'm glad I did." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Henry laughed. It was a small, quiet laugh, but it carried with it the lightness of a burden momentarily lifted. Henry's laughter echoed softly between the walls of the cafe, a sound that felt foreign, yet deeply comforting. It had been so long since he had found anything to laugh about. The small moment of relief, however, soon dissolved into a quiet sense of vulnerability. He looked down at his hands, old and worn, as if trying to ground himself before the emotions overwhelmed him again. Charlotte, sensing the shift, leaned forward. She knew this was only the beginning. The injustice Henry faced today was likely just one of many, and the weight of his past still loomed large between them. She felt an urge to do more, something that would honor not only Henry, but the countless others like him whose stories had been buried beneath the rush of modern life. "Henry," she began carefully, her voice gentle but resolute, "there's a way we can change this. Not just here, in this cafe, but on a larger scale." His eyes lifted to hers, searching for the meaning behind her words. "I want to do something to honor you and your comrades. Something meaningful, something that will remind people of what you sacrificed." Henry studied her, his expression unreadable. He had learned to manage his expectations, to keep his hopes small and his dreams modest. Promises had a way of being broken, and well-intentioned gestures often faded away. Yet there was something in Charlotte's determination that made him want to believe she was different. "What exactly are you thinking?" he asked, his voice laced with caution and curiosity. Charlotte's eyes lit up with an idea that had been forming since she learned of his past. "A ceremony," she said, the excitement in her voice building. "A public event to recognize veterans like you. We could invite the community, tell your stories, and make sure your sacrifices are never forgotten." She paused, her expression softening. "I know it might seem sudden, but your story deserves to be heard." Henry's brows furrowed, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The thought of being at the center of something so grand, so public, made him uneasy. He had spent years avoiding attention, content to blend into the background, where his memories couldn't hurt him as much. But a part of him, the part that still longed for purpose and connection, stirred at the prospect. "I don't know," he said, his voice hesitant. "I'm just one old man, Charlotte. There are so many others who did more, sacrificed more." The doubt in his voice was clear, but so was the flicker of longing that he couldn't hide. Charlotte's gaze softened. "That's exactly why we need to do this," she replied. "Because there are too many stories like yours that people have forgotten. If we don't remember and honor them now, then when..." Her conviction radiated through each word, and Henry found himself leaning into that hope, even if he wasn't entirely convinced. He sighed, the sound heavy with decades of silence and unshed grief. "It won't be easy," he said, almost to himself, reliving those memories, facing them in front of everyone. His voice trailed off, and Charlotte's heart ached for the pain he still carried. "I'll be there," she promised, her voice unwavering. "Every step of the way. You won't have to do this alone." Henry looked at her, a mix of gratitude and fear in his eyes. The decision still felt overwhelming, but Charlotte's determination was infectious. For so long, he had felt like an invisible relic of a forgotten past. But now, perhaps, there was a chance for his voice to matter once more. "All right," he whispered, his voice fragile but sincere. "Let's do it." Charlotte's smile widened, a spark of hope igniting between them. The promise of something more, something lasting, began to take shape. And as Henry sat there, a part of him dared to imagine that maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't over yet. The air felt different as Henry and Charlotte stepped outside the cafe. The crisp autumn wind swept through the streets, carrying with it the distant sounds of city life. Henry pulled his thin, worn jacket tighter around his frame, the chill sinking into bones that had long since grown weary. Charlotte walked beside him, her heels tapping rhythmically on the pavement, but her usual self-assured stride was softened with purpose. They moved together in a shared silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Charlotte was formulating plans in her mind, envisioning the ceremony she had promised. She knew it couldn't just be a fleeting act of recognition. It had to be something real, something that would ensure Henry's story and those of his fellow veterans lived on. Yet, as determined as she was, She also wondered about the emotional toll it would take on him. Henry, meanwhile, was wrestling with doubts that had been his constant companions for decades. The prospect of revisiting those old memories, of opening up wounds he had tried so hard to heal, was daunting. But he also couldn't ignore the warmth of hope that Charlotte had reignited in him. He had spent so many years fading into the background, letting history and his own pain erase him. Maybe it was time to let himself be seen. Charlotte's voice cut through his thoughts, gentle yet firm. "Would you mind if we took a walk?" she asked. "I'd like to hear more about you, about your life, your experiences. If you're comfortable sharing." Her eyes searched his face, not with pity, but with genuine curiosity and respect. Henry paused, his breath visible in the chilly air. He wasn't used to people wanting to hear his story, let alone someone like Charlotte, who could so easily have ignored him. But there was something in her request that felt different, less about curiosity and more about understanding. He nodded, offering her a small, cautious smile. "All right," he agreed, his voice almost lost in the wind. "I suppose I could share a bit more." They walked down the street, past busy shops and hurried strangers who paid them no mind. Henry's steps were slow but steady, each one a small act of resilience. "After the war," he began, his voice low, "I came back to a country that had moved on without me. My friends and I, we thought we'd be returning as heroes. But life had gone on, and people wanted to forget. We were reminders of something painful, something they didn't want to face." Charlotte listened intently, her usual businesslike demeanor replaced by empathy. She couldn't imagine the loneliness he must have felt, the sense of being a ghost in his own country. "What did you do?" she asked quietly. Henry's lips curved into a sad smile. "I tried to make a life," he said. "Got a job as a mechanic, married Mary. We had dreams, a house, maybe a couple of kids. But I wasn't whole. The war had taken more than just my youth. It had taken parts of my soul. Mary tried to hold us together, but love can only do so much when you're broken." Charlotte's heart clenched. The weight of Henry's sacrifices, the cost of a freedom so many took for granted, became painfully real. She thought of her own life, her success built on the stability and peace that men like Henry had fought for. It didn't seem fair. They continued walking, and Henry's voice grew steadier as he shared more. Moments of laughter with his war buddies, the grief of losing them, the struggle to find meaning in a world that had moved on. Charlotte absorbed every word, each story a thread weaving a tapestry of resilience and sorrow. Finally, they reached a small park, the kind where children played and life thrived. Henry stopped, looking out at the scene with a wistful expression. "I come here sometimes," he said. "It reminds me that life goes on, even if it's not the life we once imagined." Charlotte stood beside him, feeling the weight of his words and the fragile beauty of the moment. "Life did go on," she said softly, "but it wouldn't have, not like this, without you and men like you. And that's why your story matters. It's time people know." Henry turned to her, his eyes glistening with a mix of pain and gratitude. In that moment, he realized that sharing his story wasn't just about reliving the past. It was about honoring it, giving it a place in a world that had so desperately needed, and perhaps forgotten, its heroes. Henry sat down on a wooden bench overlooking the playground, the laughter of children ringing out like echoes from a world he had once fought to protect. He watched them chase each other, their laughter pure and unburdened. The simple sight tugged at something deep within him, a longing for a simpler time, before the weight of loss had carved so many lines into his face. Charlotte settled beside him, hands folded neatly in her lap. She waited, giving him space, her presence calm and steady. She could see the pain etched into his features, but she also sensed the resolve forming behind his eyes, the quiet strength of a man who had endured more than most could fathom. Henry drew in a slow breath, his chest rising and falling with a weariness that no amount of rest could soothe. He began, his voice soft. "It's funny. When I was young, I used to dream of being a hero. I thought it would mean glory, medals, and a name people would remember. But war teaches you that real heroism is nothing like that. It's ugly and brutal, full of decisions you pray you never have to make. Charlotte didn't speak, her silence a vessel for his words. She had spent years in a world where silence was often a tool of power, a way to dominate a conversation. But here, with Henry, she realized that listening, truly listening, was an act of compassion. Henry continued, his eyes fixed on the playground. I remember one night, deep in enemy territory. We were ambushed, and I had to make a choice. His hands clenched into fists, the memory still raw. I was a sergeant, and my men looked to me for guidance. I ordered them to retreat, to leave one of our own behind, because we couldn't save him without sacrificing everyone else. His voice cracked, the guilt breaking through. He was 19, barely more than a boy. Charlotte's heart broke for him, for the impossible choices he had been forced to make, choices that haunted him still. She wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but she knew this moment wasn't about easing the pain. It was about honoring it. I've spent years wondering if I made the right call, Henry said, his voice now a whisper. If I could have done more, if I failed him. His shoulders slumped, the weight of decades pressing down on him. That's what war does. It leaves you with questions that have no answers and wounds that never fully heal. Charlotte swallowed the lump in her throat. She had no platitudes to offer, no simple words to make it better. But she could offer something else, a promise. Henry, she said, her voice steady despite the ache she felt. What you did, the choices you had to make. They're part of a story that needs to be told. Not because it's perfect or heroic, but because it's real. People need to understand the cost of the world they live in, the sacrifices made for their freedom. Henry turned to look at her, the anguish in his eyes mingling with something gentler. Hope. Maybe she was right. Maybe sharing the truth, however painful, could be a way to honor the memory of those he had lost, a way to finally let go of some of the guilt that had followed him for so long. Do you really think it would make a difference? He asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Charlotte met his gaze, unwavering. I do, she said, and I'll be there to make sure it does. For a moment, they sat in the quiet understanding that had formed between them. The playground buzzed with life, a reminder that the world kept spinning, that life went on. And for the first time in years, Henry felt that maybe, just maybe, his story could still find a place in it. Henry remained on the bench, his body still, but his mind restless. The air felt heavier now, thick with the memories he had shared. The act of opening up, of allowing the shadows of his past to see the light, had left him feeling exposed. But beside him sat Charlotte, her presence a steadying force in the turbulence of his thoughts. Charlotte watched Henry carefully, sensing the internal battle he fought even now. She had learned that strength often looked different than she expected. It wasn't always loud or bold. Sometimes it was a quiet endurance, the determination to carry on even when the past was a constant weight. And Henry embodied that strength in every worn line of his face, every hesitant breath. I want to show you something, she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was gentle, but there was a quiet resolve behind it. She stood, holding out a hand. Henry glanced at her, puzzled, but after a moment's hesitation, he accepted. Her hand was warm and firm, a lifeline he hadn't realized he needed. They walked together, the city's noise a backdrop to their conversation. Charlotte led him a few blocks away to a grand building that stood out against the urban landscape, the War Memorial Museum. Its facade was solemn, carved with the names of the fallen, and Henry felt his heart clench at the sight. He had visited places like this before, but he had never felt as unprepared as he did now. Charlotte guided him inside, past displays that chronicled battles and bravery, sacrifice and sorrow. She stopped in front of a glass case, holding a worn, tattered uniform, much like the one Henry had worn all those years ago. I used to come here with my grandfather, she said, her voice thick with emotion. He'd stand in front of this display for hours, telling me about the men who wore uniforms like this one, the men who saved his village, who gave him a chance at life. Henry's eyes blurred with tears. He had always thought of museums as places that collected relics, reminders of a past no one truly wanted to remember. But now, standing here with Charlotte, he realized it was more than that. It was a place that honored the memories he carried, that preserved stories he had once feared would be forgotten. Charlotte turned to him, her expression solemn yet hopeful. "This is what I want for you," she said. "A place where your story and the stories of your brothers in arms will live on. Where people will come, like I did, and learn what real sacrifice means." Henry's grip on his cane tightened, his knuckles white. The idea of sharing everything, of putting his pain on display for strangers to see, still felt overwhelming. But beneath the fear was a glimmer of something else. The desire for his life, his choices, to mean something more. To be more than just ghosts haunting his memories. Would it really make a difference? He asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. It was the question that had haunted him for so long, the one he couldn't answer on his own. Charlotte's eyes softened. "It already has," she replied. "You've made a difference in my life, and I believe there are so many others who need to hear what you've been through, to understand the cost of the world they take for granted." Henry's gaze returned to the uniform in the case. It was a relic, yes, but it was also a testament to lives lived and lost, to sacrifices made so that others could have a future. Maybe sharing his story wouldn't bring back his fallen friends, wouldn't erase the pain of choices made, but it could honor them, ensure that they weren't forgotten. With a heavy but determined sigh, Henry nodded. "Then let's do it," he said, his voice steadier now. "Let's make sure they're remembered." Charlotte smiled, the kind of smile that spoke of hope and purpose. Together, they left the museum, a shared mission binding them. Henry's story, once a burden he carried alone, now had the chance to become a legacy. Henry walked beside Charlotte, feeling a shift within himself, like a door creaking open to possibilities he had long since locked away. The cold air bit at his skin, but he hardly noticed. His mind buzzed with the weight of what he had just agreed to. The promise to share his story, to honor the memories of his fallen brothers, and to give voice to a past that still shaped the world around him. Charlotte was deep in thought as well. Organizing a ceremony of the magnitude she envisioned would take careful planning, influence, and resources. Yet she was no stranger to such challenges. The difference this time was that the stakes felt personal, not just professional. This wasn't about winning a deal or impressing investors. It was about giving a man, a hero, the respect and recognition he deserved. They stopped at a small cafe across from the museum, the warm lights spilling out onto the street, inviting them in. "Shall we?" Charlotte asked, nodding toward the door. Henry hesitated for a moment, then nodded, following her inside. The warmth enveloped them, and they found a quiet table by the window. As they settled, Charlotte pulled out her tablet, her fingers moving swiftly as she jotted down notes. "We'll need a venue," she said, her voice filled with determination. "Somewhere with historical significance, perhaps even a connection to the war. I'll reach out to a few contacts and see what we can secure." Henry watched her work, a strange feeling stirring in his chest. It had been years since anyone had put this much effort into something for him, let alone for the men he had lost. The sense of being forgotten, of having his experiences buried under the passage of time, had become such a familiar ache. Yet here was Charlotte, treating his story like it mattered, like it was worth fighting for. "Charlotte," he said quietly, causing her to pause and look up, "why are you doing this?" The question lingered in the air, raw and genuine. "You didn't know me before today. You have no obligation to help an old man like me." She set the tablet down, meeting his gaze. "My grandfather," she began, her voice soft but unwavering, "always told me that we stand on the shoulders of giants. He used to say that everything we have today is because of the sacrifices made by people we'll never meet, people like you." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I lost him before I ever got the chance to do something meaningful to honor his memory. But now, I feel like helping you. It's a way of repaying a debt I never knew how to settle." Henry's throat tightened, and he had to blink several times to keep his own tears at bay. The sincerity in her words, the genuine gratitude she held for something he had done so long ago, was overwhelming. It was a reminder that the sacrifices he and his brothers had made hadn't been for nothing. He cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," he said, the words simple but carrying the weight of years of silence and gratitude. I don't think I ever truly believed someone would care this much. Charlotte reached across the table, placing her hand over his, a small but powerful gesture. I do, she said firmly. And so will others. We'll make sure of it. They sat there, a silent pact formed between them, two souls brought together by history and the desire to right a wrong. The plans for the ceremony began to take shape, each detail a step toward ensuring that the voices of the past would finally be heard. Henry's heart, though still burdened by the memories of war, felt lighter. The burden was no longer his alone, and as he watched Charlotte's resolve, he dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still room for hope. The cafe hummed with a low buzz of conversation, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the warm air. Henry and Charlotte sat in their quiet corner, bound together by the gravity of what lay ahead. Henry's hands were still clasped together on the table, his knuckles white from the tension that never seemed to leave his body. He felt the enormity of what he was about to do, the vulnerability of exposing his deepest scars to a world that had largely forgotten his story. Charlotte could sense his unease, the way his shoulders tensed and his eyes seemed to look inward, seeing things she could never truly understand. She placed her tablet down, leaning forward to close some of the distance between them. Henry, she said softly, if this ever feels like too much, we can stop. You've carried these memories alone for so long, and I know sharing them won't be easy. Henry looked up, meeting her gaze. The concern in her eyes was genuine, and it touched something deep within him. He had spent decades believing that no one cared, that the pain he carried was his alone to bear. But now, the idea that someone would stand with him, that he wouldn't have to face this burden alone, made him feel something he hadn't felt in years: courage. No, he said, his voice firmer than he expected. I want to do this. For them. His eyes grew distant again, and he thought of the young faces he could still remember so vividly, the laughter that had once echoed through the trenches, the dreams they had shared. They deserve to be remembered, and if telling my story can give them that, then I'm willing to face it. Charlotte's expression softened, and she reached for a cup of coffee, taking a thoughtful sip before speaking again. Then let's take it one step at a time, she said. We'll start small. Perhaps an interview, something private, just to get your story down. From there, we can decide how to share it more widely. She paused, then added, and I'll be there every step of the way. Henry nodded, his resolve solidifying. The idea of an interview, of speaking his truth into a recorder, seemed more manageable. It wasn't standing in front of a crowd, not yet. It was a chance to start slowly, to feel his way through the memories without being overwhelmed. But even as he agreed, the weight of the past pressed harder on his chest. Talking about it, he murmured almost to himself, means going back there. Reliving it, his voice trembled, and he hated how fragile it sounded. The thought of returning to those moments, of feeling the cold, choking fear of war, was almost too much to bear. Charlotte set her cup down, her hands clasping together in a gesture of solidarity. You're not that young soldier anymore, she said, her voice calm and reassuring. You're here with people who want to listen and support you. It won't erase the pain, but maybe it can lighten the burden. Henry's eyes filled with unshed tears, the vulnerability catching him off guard. The strength he had always prided himself on seemed to waver. But maybe he realized strength didn't have to mean facing everything alone. Maybe it could mean having someone by your side. Thank you, he whispered, the words so quiet he wasn't sure she heard them. But the way Charlotte's eyes softened, the way she offered him a small, knowing smile, told him she did. They sat in that moment, a fragile but powerful understanding between them. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with the ghosts of the past and the challenges of facing a world that had changed while Henry had stayed haunted. But for the first time, he felt the smallest flicker of hope. And so, with a shared resolve, they began planning the first steps. A private interview, a room where Henry could speak freely, where his memories could be released from the prison of his silence. It was a start, just a start, but it was enough for now. And maybe, he dared to hope, it would be enough to finally bring peace to the men who had never made it home. If this story moved you and made you reflect on the sacrifices so many have made for the life we enjoy today, I invite you to share your thoughts and tributes in the comments. Your voice matters, and by commenting, you help keep these memories alive. Give this video a like to spread this message even further, so more people understand the true meaning of courage and sacrifice. And if stories like this inspire you and make you see life differently, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Together, we can honor the past and learn from it. Don't let these stories be forgotten. Share this with someone who needs to hear it.